In the summer of 1941, when Hitler's forces launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, few outside the German High Command understood the logistical nightmare that lay ahead. Over 3 million Axis soldiers, supported by 600,000 vehicles, poured into the Soviet Union along a 1,000-mile front. The plan was lightning-fast conquest, a war of weeks, not years. Yet within months, engines froze, convoys stalled, and fuel depots ran dry. What followed was not just a clash of armies, but a brutal struggle against distance, weather, and terrain. Amid this chaos, a forgotten army began to move. Not with tanks or trucks, but with hooves and harnesses. They were the Italians, the men of the Corpo di Truppa Alpine, the elite mountain corps trained for the rugged Alps, now thrust into the boundless expanse of Russia. Their mission was simple, but vital: keep the front supplied, whatever the cost. And in doing so, they became the quiet lifeline of Hitler's eastern armies. When Italy joined the invasion, it contributed not just infantry, but also something the Germans sorely lacked: thousands of pack animals and the men who knew how to use them. The German Wehrmacht, obsessed with mechanization, had underestimated how quickly the Russian terrain would devour machines. Tanks sank in mud. Trucks broke axles on frozen ruts. Fuel convoys froze solid overnight. But the Italians, drawing on centuries of Alpine tradition, brought an older kind of mobility, one powered by endurance, instinct, and the steady rhythm of mule hooves. By the autumn of 1941, Italy's Alpine Corps had deployed over 14,000 mules to the Eastern Front. Each animal could carry 100 kilograms of ammunition, rations, or fuel. Combined, they delivered an estimated 600 tons of supplies per day, not to the rear, but directly to the forward positions where German and Italian troops fought and died. Their routes snaked through forests, across frozen rivers, and over snow-covered ridges where no vehicle could go. German officers at first regarded the Italians with skepticism. To them, the mule columns seemed anachronistic, a relic of another century. But when the first winter struck, their skepticism turned to astonishment. Temperatures plunged below 40 degrees in. Steel cracked, oil turned to wax, and engines refused to start. Yet the Italian supply lines continued to move. Wrapped in layers of wool and leather, mule drivers trudged through blizzards with ropes in their hands, guiding their animals by touch and voice alone. Each convoy was a world unto itself, a column of shadows winding through white silence. The men moved mostly at night, when Soviet aircraft were grounded by the cold. They walked 20 miles per shift, stopping only to thaw their fingers by small, shielded fires. Frostbite claimed more lives than enemy bullets. Diaries recovered after the war tell of soldiers cutting frozen bread with bayonets and of mules collapsing mid-step, their bodies stiffening before they hit the ground. The Italians' routes supported not only their own divisions, but also vast stretches of the German 6th Army and Romanian units along the Don River. When the Wehrmacht advanced toward Stalingrad in 1942, the Italian Logistics Corps was stretched to breaking. Yet they delivered 90,000 liters of fuel per week, crates of mortar shells, and tons of rations that sustained front-line troops. German supply officers, forced to admit their dependence, began integrating Italian mule teams into their own logistics plans. Captured documents from the Wehrmacht's Army Group South headquarters contain this terse acknowledgement. Without the Italian columns, the Don sector would collapse within weeks. But the cost was terrible. The mules, bred for alpine slopes, were ill-suited to the endless Russian steppe. They suffered frostbite, malnutrition, and exhaustion. Thousands died where they stood, their bodies quickly covered by drifting snow. Soldiers gave them names, spoke to them like comrades, and wept when they fell. The bond between man and animal became one of necessity and survival. One Alpini officer later recalled, "In the end, our mules became our brothers. They carried our food, our ammunition, our wounded. When they could no longer walk, we buried them with the same care as a man." As the winter deepened, the Italians' endurance astonished even their allies. German reports praised their discipline and skill. A field log dated January 1942 read simply, "Italian transport, operational despite total mechanical failure of German units. It was a statement of quiet admiration and dependence. The logistic system the Italians maintained was not glamorous, but it was indispensable. Each night, their columns crept forward, invisible arteries keeping the Axis war machine alive. They carried bread baked days earlier in field ovens, tins of fuel sealed against the cold, and ammunition packed in straw. Every bullet fired at the front had once hung from the back of a mule. Behind them lay the frozen corpses of animals and men. Ahead of them, the black void of another Russian night. Yet they marched. By the summer of 1942, the Italian Mule Corps had become a permanent fixture of the Don front. They built makeshift stables from shattered wagons, improvised shoeing stations, and repaired saddles with wire. Their expertise allowed them to move supplies even during Rasputitsa, the dreaded mud season, when roads became rivers of sludge. Trucks sank to their axles, but the mules trudged on, their hooves gripping the muck. When Operation Blue, the German summer offensive, began, it was the Italians who ensured the flow of supplies toward Stalingrad. Day after day, they hauled the lifeblood of war, fuel, bread, and bullets. The Axis front stretched thin across hundreds of miles, but its beating heart pulsed through those Italian columns. For 18 months, they defied geography itself. Through the biting cold and the suffocating heat, they kept the supply lines breathing. Until, at last, the land struck back. In December 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Little Saturn, a massive counteroffensive targeting the Axis flanks. The Italian Eighth Army, stretched and undersupplied, bore the brunt of the assault. The Mule Corps, caught in the chaos, tried desperately to evacuate wounded and destroy supplies before they fell into enemy hands. Columns disintegrated under artillery fire. Convoys were lost in blizzards. Frozen men clung to their mules for warmth, only to die standing beside them. The trails that had once sustained the front became its graveyards. In the final days of the retreat, surviving Alpini burned their supply wagons to stay warm. Mules were shot to prevent capture. The last Italian convoy recorded on the Don River disappeared on January 22, 1943. 180 men and 300 animals lost without a trace. Yet even in death, their mission endured. For without them, the Eastern Front would have collapsed months earlier. German officers later admitted it openly in debriefings. Without the Italian supply columns, the Don Front would have fallen months earlier. The forgotten mule drivers of Italy had carried more than supplies. They had carried the impossible burden of a doomed war. When the survivors of the Don campaign staggered back to Italy, what returned was not an army, but a shadow of one. Frostbitten, starved, and broken, the remnants of the Alpine Corps carried home a story few wanted to hear. They had not fought glorious battles or captured cities. They had carried boxes, hauled fuel, and led mules through blizzards. Yet without them, the entire Axis campaign in the East might have ended far sooner. In official communiqué, their contribution was buried beneath euphemisms. The fascist press spoke vaguely of rear area service and support operations. But the diaries and letters of the men told another story, one of endurance, loss, and quiet heroism. "We were the blood vessels," one soldier wrote, "and when we froze, the body died." To understand the scale of their effort, one must grasp the geography they faced. The Don River front stretched across a vast plain of snow and mud, interrupted by small villages, frozen creeks, and endless emptiness. The Italian Mule Corps operated in all of it, from the foothills of the Caucasus to the open steppe. Their supply routes sometimes extended over 300 kilometers, with no proper roads and few landmarks. Navigation was done by instinct, by the shape of the stars, and by the faint memory of the last farmhouse passed hours earlier. The mules themselves were living machines of war. Each one could carry enough ammunition to resupply a frontline company, or enough fuel to keep a tank battalion moving for another day. But their usefulness depended entirely on the bond between man and animal. Italian handlers treated their mules with care born of necessity. They brushed their coats in the dark, whispered commands in dialect, and carried small sacks of oats to feed them when official rations ran out. The Germans noticed the difference. In their reports, they remarked that Italian animals were better fed and longer lived than their own horses. The Italians, one German quartermaster wrote, understand that the animal is not a tool, but a comrade. And yet, the cruelty of the front consumed everything. Soviet aircraft hunted supply lines mercilessly. In daylight, even a small column could be seen from miles away, leaving trails of steam and dust. The Italian mule drivers learned to move only at night or under cloud cover. They built makeshift camouflage nets from branches, and when attacked, scattered their columns into the snow to avoid annihilation. The Soviets understood the strategic value of these columns. Captured Red Army reports from 1942 describe targeted raids on mule depots and supply bases. "Destroy the pack animals," one order read, "and the fascist advance will starve." It was true. When the Italians lost their mules, entire divisions went hungry. A single ambush could paralyze a sector for days. In the deep winter of 1942, an Alpini detachment was assigned to deliver ammunition to a German artillery regiment near Serafimovich. Temperatures hovered around 38 declassified. The convoy, 180 men, 220 mules, and 40 sledges, set out before dusk. By morning, only a handful had reached the destination. The rest had frozen along the way, some standing, their reins still in hand. When the Germans found them, they buried them in the snow and erected a simple sign. "Here marched those who kept us alive." Despite the losses, the Italian Mule Corps continued to operate through the crisis. They improvised constantly. When fodder ran out, they mixed sawdust into the animals' feed. When harnesses broke, they repaired them with rope and wire. When gasoline was needed at the front, they filled empty wine barrels and strapped them to the sides of the animals. Everything was used, nothing wasted. By late 1942, the mule columns had become so vital that German commanders began to formally request Italian transport detachments for their sectors. The once dismissed auxiliaries had become indispensable. In one memo from General Hans von Salmuth, dated October 1942, he wrote, "Italian pack transport has proven to be the only reliable means of maintaining supply under present conditions. Recommend expansion of units if possible." But expansion was impossible. The Italians were already stretched to the limit. Every day they lost animals to cold and exhaustion, and replacements were scarce. Supply lines to Italy ran through hundreds of miles of hostile terrain, and even when new mules arrived by rail, many died within weeks from exposure. Still, the men persisted. Letters sent home reveal their stoic acceptance. "We walk all night and sleep on our feet," one soldier wrote. "The snow glows blue in the moonlight. The mules breathe like engines. When one falls, we take the load ourselves." The retreat from the Don in January 1943 was the final test of their endurance. When Soviet armored divisions shattered the Italian lines, the Mule Corps was ordered to evacuate ammunition dumps and evacuate the wounded. They loaded sledges and makeshift carts, pushing through waist-deep snow as the Red Army advanced. Every step was a fight against cold and despair. An eyewitness from the German 298th Infantry Division described the scene. "The Italians did not abandon their mules, even when shells fell among them. They moved in silence, men and animals together, like ghosts. They carried not only their own wounded, but ours as well." Many never returned. Columns vanished into the white horizon, erased by snow and time. Others were captured and sent to Soviet camps, where few survived. By the spring of 1943, the Italian Mule Corps in Russia was effectively destroyed. Out of nearly 60,000 men, fewer than half made it home. Those who did carried memories that haunted them for life. In post-war interviews, they spoke not of glory, but of cold, the kind that burned through flesh and bone. They remembered the sound of hooves crunching on snow, the silence after a bombardment, the way frost formed on the eyelashes of the mules. After Italy's armistice in 1943, many surviving Alpini were taken prisoner by the Germans, or joined the partisan resistance. Their experience on the Eastern Front gave them a grim understanding of endurance and suffering. Some used their skills with pack animals to move weapons through the mountains during the civil war that followed. But the official histories, both fascist and post-war, largely ignored them. The Italian campaign in Russia was a national trauma, and the mule driver's story fit no heroic narrative. They were neither victors nor celebrated martyrs. They were logistics men, ghosts in the machinery of war. Yet, in quiet villages across northern Italy, small monuments still stand. Simple plaques with names and unit numbers, often carved with the image of a mule. On certain winter nights, veterans would gather in Alpine taverns, raise a glass of grappa, and speak softly of I muli del Don, the mules of the dawn. In Germany, the memory was different. In Wehrmacht archives recovered after the war, Italian mule units are mentioned again and again, often with respect and gratitude. One report from Army Group South concluded, "The Italian supply troops, though lightly equipped, have demonstrated exceptional endurance and loyalty. Their contribution to maintaining operations in extreme conditions cannot be overstated." It was a rare admission in a war defined by hierarchy and arrogance. But even then, few outside the officers' corps understood what it meant. Logistics rarely makes headlines. Wars are remembered for their battles, not for the men who carried boxes through the dark. Yet, in the endless snow of the Eastern Front, it was those men, and their mules, who made survival possible. They fed armies, carried fuel for tanks, and hauled ammunition for guns that would otherwise have fallen silent. They fought not with rifles, but with ropes, hooves, and unyielding endurance. By the time spring thawed the Russian plains in 1943, the remains of Italy's Mule Corps lay scattered across hundreds of miles, frozen under the same snow that had once carried them forward. But their story, though buried, survived in fragments, in diaries, in letters, in the memories of those who watched them pass like phantoms through the night. When the ice began to melt on the Don River in the spring of 1943, the silence left behind by the Italian Mule Corps was deafening. Entire units had vanished without a trace. Only scattered relics remained, rusted harness buckles, shattered sleds, and the skeletal remains of mules half buried in the thawing snow. Soviet patrols moving through the abandoned Axis positions found strange scenes. Carefully arranged supply crates, abandoned saddles, and letters written in Italian, frozen mid-sentence. For months afterward, search parties combed the vast plains, hoping to recover survivors. What they found instead were testaments to quiet endurance. Makeshift shelters dug into snowbanks, half-burned maps, empty food tins arranged in neat rows. The Italians had tried to maintain order even in collapse. In death, they remained disciplined. Those who survived captivity spoke of unimaginable conditions. Many were taken to camps near Tambov and Suzdal, where frostbite, starvation, and disease killed thousands. The mule drivers, accustomed to the cold of the Alps, endured longer than most, but their memories of Russia were branded into their minds. One survivor recalled, "The snow there had no color. It was grey, endless, and full of ghosts." Back in Italy, news of the disaster trickled home slowly. The fascist regime tried to suppress the scale of the losses, publishing vague communiques about strategic redeployments. But in small towns across Lombardy, Piedmont, and the Veneto, the truth arrived in the form of silence. Families received no letters, no bodies, only the knowledge that their sons had gone east and never returned. In the years that followed, the survivors began to tell their stories. Some wrote memoirs that went largely unnoticed, printed in small regional presses, or circulated privately among veterans groups. Their tone was rarely bitter, more often weary, reflective, marked by an understanding that they had played their part in something far larger and more indifferent than themselves. A recurring theme in these accounts was the contrast between the Italian and German attitudes toward war. The Italians, trained for mountain warfare, viewed survival as an art of patience and adaptation. The Germans, obsessed with speed and control, often refused to listen to local advice. When the German trucks froze or sank into mud, the Italians quietly passed by with their mules. They laughed at us in the summer, one Alpini wrote, but in the winter they followed in our tracks. This dynamic created a strange kind of respect between the two allies. German officers came to rely on the Italians' expertise. They learned how to pack supplies for long journeys, how to protect rifles from frost, how to find dry firewood even under snow. In return, the Italians gained access to German fuel depots and rations. Cooperation born of necessity replaced ideology. Still, mistrust lingered. Many Italians resented the arrogance of their allies, while the Germans viewed the Italians as unreliable. But on the frozen steppe, such distinctions faded quickly. Hunger and cold were equalizers. A German officer might depend on an Italian mule driver to deliver his ammunition, and both knew that without that delivery, neither would live to see another dawn. Among the most striking documents to emerge after the war was a collection of letters written by Captain Angelo Moreschi, an Alpini officer stationed near Milarovo. His correspondence paints a vivid picture of the day-to-day struggle to keep the supply lines open. "Each mule is worth a truck," he wrote in December 1942. "Each driver is worth 10 men with engines. The snow has swallowed everything else." Moreschi's letters also reveal the moral fatigue that set in as the campaign dragged on. "We no longer think of victory," he wrote. "We think of warmth, of food, of keeping the mules alive. Sometimes I believe the animals understand more than we do. They do not ask why." When the Soviet counteroffensive began, Moreschi's unit was caught in the encirclement. His final letter, dated January 18, 1943, ends abruptly. "The snow is falling again. We will try to move tonight. The mules are tired, but so are we. If we cannot reach the river, we will stay here with them." He was never heard from again. Such stories were repeated across hundreds of miles. The retreat from the Don became a nightmare of frost, hunger, and chaos. Men burned what little they had to stay alive. Ammunition boxes, saddles, even their own wooden rifles when food ran out. Some tried to eat the frozen flesh of dead animals, only to fall ill and die in the snow. Yet amid the horror, there were acts of astonishing courage. One Alpini medic, Sergeant Carlo Bertolini, led a group of wounded Germans across the frozen plains, using 2 surviving mules to pull a sled improvised from a broken door. When they were discovered by Soviet troops days later, Bertolini was still holding the reins, half frozen but alive. He refused to abandon the animals, insisting that they be fed before he was taken to the field hospital. Such humanity was not uncommon among the Italians. Even as the war hardened men into survivalists, the Mule Corps retained a strange gentleness. They treated their animals with respect and extended that compassion to others, including civilians and prisoners. Soviet villagers remembered them as quiet men who shared bread and cigarettes, unlike many of their German counterparts. This moral endurance, a kind of quiet decency in the midst of catastrophe, became part of the legend of the Alpini. After the war, Italian historians would look back on the Russian campaign as both a tragedy and a testament to resilience. It showed in stark relief the limits of ideology and the strength of simple human endurance. The military significance of the Mule Corps, however, was enormous. According to declassified German reports, the Italians delivered over 200,000 tons of supplies between 1941 and 1943, a figure that defied the logistical constraints of the front. Without those deliveries, entire divisions would have starved or run out of ammunition. The Wehrmacht's dependence on animal transport, once dismissed as primitive, had proven decisive. The irony was cruel. In a war defined by modern technology, the most effective supply system on the Eastern Front was one powered by mules and men walking through the night. When the war ended, the memory of those men faded quickly. Italy, torn apart by occupation and civil conflict, had little appetite to honor the soldiers who had served in Hitler's war. The mule drivers returned to find their country unrecognizable, cities in ruins, fascism discredited, the monarchy collapsing. They shed their uniforms, sold their medals, and tried to disappear into ordinary life. But memory has its own persistence. In the decades that followed, local historians began collecting testimonies, letters, and photographs from survivors. Small museums in Alpine towns displayed saddles, harnesses, and faded maps. School children learned the names of lost battalions. Every January, memorial marches were held in the snow, following the routes once taken by the mule columns. For many Italians, the story of the Alpine Mule Corps became more than a tale of war. It was a parable about endurance, loyalty, and the quiet dignity of labor. These men had not sought glory. They had done their duty in silence, feeding a machine of destruction they barely understood. And yet, their endurance outlasted the empire they served. In recent years, researchers have begun to re-examine the logistical dimensions of the Eastern Front, uncovering how fragile the Axis war effort truly was. The Italian Mule Corps, once dismissed as a footnote, now stands as a symbol of the hidden forces that shape history, the invisible hands that carry armies across continents, and the human cost that makes every advance possible. It is said that amateurs talk about strategy, but professionals talk about logistics. The story of the Italian Mule Corps is proof of that truth. They were not strategists, not heroes in the conventional sense. They were the gears that kept the war turning, until the gears themselves ground to dust. When the last surviving mule drivers gathered for reunions in the 1970s, they spoke less of the war than of the silence afterward, the years when no one asked, when no one wanted to remember. Yet among themselves, they shared a quiet pride. "We carried everything," one old soldier said. "Food, bullets, wounded, hope. When there was nothing left to carry, we carried each other." Their legacy endures not in monuments or parades, but in the faint echo of hooves across snow, the forgotten rhythm of a lifeline that once kept an empire alive. The story of Italy's Alpine Mule Corps is not only one of endurance, but also of a clash between two worlds: the mechanical modernity that Germany idolized, and the organic pragmatism that Italy embodied. In the factories of Turin and Milan, Mussolini's regime had promised to create a modern industrial army. Yet, when war came, it was not machines that saved Italian soldiers in Russia, but the same pack animals that had carried artillery through the Dolomites a generation earlier. This irony was not lost on the men themselves. "They said we would ride into the future," one Alpini wrote after the war, "but we went to Russia with the same mules our grandfathers had used in 1915. What those mules represented was not backwardness, but adaptation, the survival of a tradition older than tanks or aircraft, a living link between man and terrain. To understand their effectiveness, one must look at the anatomy of the Italian logistics system. Unlike the Germans, who built massive depots dependent on railheads and mechanized columns, the Italians relied on flexibility. Their supply chains were modular, broken into hundreds of small detachments that could move independently. Each unit, usually 50 to 100 men, with 70 or 80 mules, carried specific loads: food, ammunition, medical supplies, or engineering materials. The system allowed them to bypass destroyed roads and shift routes quickly in response to combat conditions. Italian mule drivers were trained to read terrain like sailors read the sea. They could sense soft ground under snow, predict the stability of ice, and find dry shelter for animals in a landscape that seemed barren. Each column carried its own blacksmith and veterinary assistant. Every evening, men gathered around small fires to inspect hooves and patch harnesses. A damaged mule was as serious a loss as a broken truck engine. Communication was primitive but efficient. Orders were passed verbally, written in small notebooks wrapped in oiled cloth, or marked with colored ribbons tied to harnesses. In the confusion of battle, the drivers relied on songs, low, rhythmic chants that kept the animals calm and told others the column's direction. These songs, half prayer and half signal, became the heartbeat of the frozen front. German officers who witnessed the Italians at work were often struck by the strange calm of their movements. "They do everything slowly," one wrote, "but nothing stops them." The pace of the mule columns, steady, deliberate, unhurried, was the opposite of the blitzkrieg mentality. Yet that slowness proved its strength. While German logistics units burned through fuel and manpower, the Italians sustained operations with minimal resources. Their endurance inspired a peculiar admiration even among enemies. Soviet prisoners later testified that the Italians were unlike any other Axis troops they encountered. They shared food, allowed prisoners to ride when wounded, and treated them with a degree of humanity absent elsewhere on the front. One captured Red Army soldier recalled being fed bread and wine by an Italian convoy commander who whispered, "War is for the madmen, not for the hungry." Such gestures did not go unnoticed by German officers, who viewed them with suspicion. Kindness was not an approved form of discipline in the Reich, but for the Italians, compassion was a survival instinct. They understood that cruelty wasted energy, and that the line between man and animal, between soldier and victim, could vanish in the cold. As the months dragged on, the logistical miracle continued. Between the summer of 1941 and the winter of 1942, Italian mule units covered more than 122 million ton-miles of supply, an almost unimaginable figure achieved without a single major rail network. Their convoys fed divisions spread across the Donbassan, the Caucasus foothills, and the steppes beyond Kharkov. When mechanized units failed, the Italians filled the gaps. But their success created resentment. Some German officers viewed the Italians' competence as an embarrassment, a reminder that technology alone could not conquer nature. There were even cases where German command attempted to requisition Italian mules for their own use, sparking heated confrontations. "They take our animals," an Italian sergeant wrote in his diary, "and leave us to starve. But when their trucks freeze, they come begging for our help." The tension reached a peak in late 1942, when Italian mule units were ordered to assist in supplying the encircled German forces near Stalingrad. It was a mission born of desperation. The front was collapsing, Soviet pressure was mounting, and the Luftwaffe's airlift could deliver only a fraction of what was needed. The Italians, operating hundreds of miles away, were asked to push supplies as far east as possible, through snowstorms, under constant attack, and with dwindling numbers of animals. They did not hesitate. For weeks, they marched through terrain where even tanks had stopped moving. Their convoys left trails of broken crates and frozen bodies. Many never reached their destinations, swallowed by the vastness of Russia. But those who did delivered the last ammunition and rations some German soldiers would ever see. When the Soviet counteroffensive erupted in December, the same Italian units were trapped in the maelstrom. The retreat became an epic of suffering that few would survive. Mule drivers loaded the wounded onto sledges and continued walking even as Soviet tanks appeared on the horizon. The sound of gunfire mixed with the cries of animals and the howl of the wind. One Alpini wrote, "The steppe was burning, but the snow kept falling. We followed the mules because they always knew where to go. Forward, always forward." In those final weeks, the distinction between soldier and beast vanished entirely. Men and animals froze together, starved together, died together. Survivors described scenes of surreal beauty and horror, northern lights flickering above burning villages, silence broken only by the cracking of ice underfoot and the dull thud of hooves muffled by snow. When the retreat finally ended, only fragments of the Italian 8th Army remained. Of the nearly 230,000 Italians who had been sent to Russia, fewer than 90,000 returned. Among them, the mule drivers were some of the hardest hit. Entire transport companies were wiped out. Records show losses of over 70% in some sectors. Yet, even in defeat, the Germans acknowledged their debt. In post-war interrogations, several Wehrmacht officers admitted that without the Italian logistics network, the Southern Front would have collapsed months earlier. One colonel summarized it bluntly. "They carried us, literally." After the war, these admissions were quietly filed away. The Allies, focused on rebuilding Europe and reshaping narratives, had little interest in stories that complicated the moral map of the conflict. Italy, eager to distance itself from its fascist past, erased much of the Eastern Front from public memory. The mule drivers became ghosts again, not defeated, but forgotten. In the mountain villages of northern Italy, however, their memory endured. Every year, on the anniversary of the Don disaster, survivors gathered in snow-covered squares to light candles and sing the old Alpini hymns. The songs were slow, mournful, echoing the rhythms of the mule trains that once crossed the Russian plains. Among them walked the descendants of the animals that had carried the war. Many villages kept mules long after the war ended, not for labor, but as symbols, living reminders of endurance and sacrifice. Children learned to feed them gently, to listen for their steady breathing. "This one's grandfather went to Russia," the old men would say, half in jest, half in reverence. It is in these quiet rituals that the true legacy of the Italian Mule Corps survives. Not in museums or military records, but in the collective memory of small communities that understood what the war had taken, and what it had revealed. The war on the Eastern Front was a confrontation between industrial power and human endurance. Germany brought the machines. Italy brought the muscle, the instinct, and the patience of those who had fought mountains long before they fought men. The mules were not a symbol of weakness, but of adaptability, the last, stubborn heartbeat of a human-scale war in a mechanized age. As one surviving Alpini veteran said decades later, standing beside a monument of stone and bronze carved with the image of a mule, "The tanks rusted, the planes crashed, but our mules, they kept walking." When historians today speak of the Eastern Front, they often evoke the vast tank battles, the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, and the millions of soldiers swallowed by the steppe. Yet beneath that grand, tragic scale lies a quieter story. One carried on the backs of mules and the shoulders of men who never fired a shot in anger, but upon whose labor entire armies depended. The Italian Alpine Mule Corps represents one of the last great examples of pre-industrial logistics operating inside a mechanized war, a bridge between two eras of warfare, and between survival and collapse. By 1944, most of what had once been the Italian expeditionary force in Russia existed only in memory and rumor. The fascist government, desperate to maintain morale, rarely acknowledged the scale of the disaster. When Italy switched sides later that year, joining the Allies after Mussolini's fall, official histories of the conflict were rewritten to emphasize resistance and redemption, not the suffering of men who had served on Hitler's front. The mule drivers, whose hands had carried supplies for the Wehrmacht, were now politically inconvenient reminders of a lost war fought for the wrong cause. But memory has its own stubborn persistence. In the post-war years, former muleteers and Alpini veterans began forming associations, preserving their stories and keeping the truth alive. They met in mountain lodges and local town halls, bringing faded maps, dog-eared photographs, and battered field journals. They were not storytellers by nature, yet they understood that silence would erase them entirely. "If we do not speak," one veteran said, "then even the mules will be forgotten." Through their testimonies, a remarkable image emerged, that of a supply network held together not by ideology, but by professionalism, by men who believed in duty, not in Mussolini. Many of them had no illusions about the war they served. Their diaries reveal a tone of fatalism, even quiet rebellion. "We march because the orders come," one wrote. "We survive because the mules do." American and British intelligence reports compiled after the war corroborated much of what the veterans later described. Declassified assessments from 1945 note that Axis supply failures were most acute wherever animal transport had been neglected, and that Italian mountain troops provided disproportionately successful logistical performance under adverse conditions. Ironically, in the language of cold military analysis, their courage was finally acknowledged. In the mountains of northern Italy, where the Alpini tradition remains a source of regional pride, younger generations began to rediscover this history in the 1950s and 1960s. School teachers invited veterans to speak. Memorial plaques appeared on church walls. One particularly haunting inscription in Bergamo reads simply, "To those who carried the weight of war." No rank, no flag, no mention of victory, only the burden. As Italy rebuilt itself into a modern democracy, the idea of the mule drivers took on a new symbolic meaning. They became, in popular memory, the embodiment of endurance and humility, men who had served faithfully, not fanatically. Their story offered an alternative to the extremes of fascism and resistance, showing a middle ground of human persistence amid catastrophe. From a military standpoint, historians now recognize that the Italian contribution to Axis logistics on the Eastern Front was far greater than previously recorded. The Corpo di Truppa Alpine maintained a daily throughput of up to 600 tons of supplies at its peak, a figure rivaling that of mechanized convoys, but achieved under infinitely harsher conditions. The fact that these deliveries continued even after communications collapsed and air support vanished is a testament to the organizational discipline and ingenuity of the troops involved. But numbers cannot capture the atmosphere of that frozen world. To imagine it, one must picture endless columns snaking through the darkness, each man wrapped in layers of tattered wool, his breath turning to ice before it leaves his lips. The soundscape was minimal, hooves crunching in snow, harness bells muffled by frost, and the distant rumble of artillery over the horizon. When dawn broke, the world turned white and blinding, and every shadow seemed an enemy. One memoir describes how, on certain nights, the drivers would stop for a few minutes to rest and listen. The silence was so deep, the author wrote, that we could hear the snow falling on the mules' ears. That silence, more than gunfire or explosions, was the defining sound of their war. The relationship between man and animal was more than practical. It was spiritual. In the endless expanse of Russia, the mules were both companions and guides. Soldiers spoke of them as if they possessed a sixth sense, able to find paths through blizzards or sense danger before humans did. One veteran remembered a night when his entire unit was saved because the mules refused to cross a certain patch of snow. Moments later, artillery shells struck exactly where they would have walked. After that, he said, we stopped thinking of them as beasts. They were our brothers. This bond blurred the lines between human and animal endurance. When food ran out, many soldiers shared their rations equally. When mules died, they were buried with military honors, their names sometimes written on wooden crosses beside the men they had served. Such rituals gave meaning to a war otherwise devoid of sense. There is something deeply revealing about how the Italians approached their task. While their German counterparts treated logistics as an equation of inputs and outputs, the Italians treated it as a matter of survival and craft. They adjusted loads by instinct, measured distance by memory, and navigated the snow by smell and sound. It was not science, but experience, a kind of knowledge that cannot be taught in academies, only earned through hardship. German officers, many of them trained engineers, were often humbled by what they witnessed. Their discipline is not mechanical but moral, wrote one observer. They obey not out of fear, but because they cannot conceive of abandoning their comrades. Such respect rarely translated into official recognition, but it lingered in private letters and reports. After the war, several Wehrmacht officers testified to Allied investigators that the Italian Mule Corps had sustained the southern front far longer than logistics should have allowed. Some even credited the Italians with delaying the Soviet advance long enough for German forces to regroup. Without them, one wrote, the retreat would have been a rout, not an orderly withdrawal. That order came at a terrible price. Of the roughly 60,000 Italians assigned to logistics and transport duties on the Eastern Front, nearly 35,000 were killed, captured, or froze to death. Entire battalions disappeared without record, their names erased by snow and time. The survivors bore scars both visible and hidden, frostbitten limbs, chronic illness, and a lifetime of memories they could never fully share. In post-war Italy, they were often met with indifference or shame. The new republic wanted heroes of liberation, not veterans of a fascist expedition. The mule drivers, like many who had served under Mussolini, retreated into silence. They found solace in work, in the rhythm of rural life, in the familiarity of the mountains. Yet in private, among their own, they remembered every step of that long, frozen road. One of the last surviving veterans, interviewed in the 1990s, summed up their legacy with quiet dignity. "We were not heroes," he said. "We were carriers. But someone must carry the weight, or nothing moves. The war eats everything. food, men, animals, and still it wants more. We carried until there was nothing left to carry. That simple truth lies at the heart of their story. Wars are remembered for victories and defeats, for generals and battles. But beneath every triumph and disaster lies a hidden foundation. The millions of hands and hooves that moved the supplies, the letters, the wounded, the hope. The Italian mule drivers were among those invisible foundations. Without them, the grand strategies of the Eastern Front would have crumbled into frozen futility. Today, as military historians re-examine the logistics of World War II, their contributions are gaining overdue recognition. The Mule Corps, once dismissed as an anachronism, is now understood as a model of adaptive warfare, proof that flexibility and endurance can succeed where machines fail. Their legacy endures not in museums, but in the lessons of resilience they left behind. In an age where war has become ever more mechanized, their story is a reminder of something timeless. That no machine can replace the strength of human will and the bond between living beings in the face of unimaginable hardship. In the final years of their lives, the last of the Italian mule drivers carried memories that history had nearly forgotten. Images of white plains stretching forever, of silent marches beneath the northern lights, of mules breathing steam into the freezing dark. They had no monuments in their honor, no parades, no medals that could capture the weight they bore. But within their fading recollections lived one of the purest examples of endurance in modern war. Men and animals defying both nature and despair to keep an army alive. The post-war decades were not kind to them. Italy, consumed by reconstruction and political transformation, turned its gaze westward. The tragedy of Russia became a subject of whispers, a wound too deep and politically tangled to reopen, yet the memory refused to die. In villages like Cuneo, Belluno, and Trento, where the Alpine regiments had drawn most of their recruits, old men still gathered every January to drink, sing, and remember. Their songs were not about glory, they were about cold, hunger, and the bond between comrades. Historians who later studied these gatherings were struck by the absence of hatred in their words. They spoke little of the enemy, and much of the snow, the silence, and the animals that had saved them. To them, Russia was not a battlefield, but a vast, indifferent landscape that tested every limit of the human spirit. One veteran said, "The snow did not care who we were, fascist, German, or Russian. It only cared how long we could stand." Over time, the Mule Corps story became more than a chapter of military history. It evolved into a moral parable about humility, loyalty, and the quiet strength found in persistence. Scholars have since described it as an example of horizontal heroism, courage not in battle, but in carrying the burdens of others. The men of the Corpo di Truppa Alpine embodied that ideal. They endured without expectation of praise, without illusion of victory, without hatred for those who opposed them. In the 1970s and 1980s, a new generation of Italian historians began to revisit the Eastern Front with fresh eyes. Using declassified German and Soviet archives, they pieced together the logistical reality of the Don campaign. Their findings were staggering. In a war where mechanized transport failed catastrophically, Italy's animal-based system had achieved near-miraculous results. Mule trains could deliver food and ammunition across terrain impassable to vehicles, with reliability rates exceeding 85% even under enemy fire. German engineers, analyzing these figures after the war, concluded that no other supply method functioned under such extremes. The paradox was complete. In a war of tanks, aircraft, and industrial might, it was the mule, one of humanity's oldest companions, that had proven most dependable. This fact haunted post-war military theorists. It exposed a simple truth. Technology could not erase geography, nor could ideology conquer nature. The Italians, drawing on centuries of mountain warfare, had succeeded where machines failed. Their endurance also revealed something deeper about the nature of war itself. In every army, behind every front line, there exists an invisible class of laborers, the haulers, cooks, drivers, and mechanics, whose toil sustains the illusion of motion and power. The Italian Mule Corps belonged to that silent brotherhood. They did not kill, but without them, killing would have stopped. They did not win, but without them, defeat would have come sooner. Through the 1980s, documentaries and oral histories began to appear on Italian television. Viewers saw grainy footage of men leading mules through snow, faces wrapped in scarves, their eyes hollow from exhaustion. The footage came from a German newsreel crew embedded with the Alpini in 1942, propaganda that, ironically, preserved one of the most honest portraits of suffering in the war. Audiences were stunned. For many Italians, it was the first time they had seen what Russia truly meant for their fathers and grandfathers. A wave of books followed. Memoirs long out of print were republished. Historians such as Giorgio Rochai and Nuto Ravelli, himself a former Alpini officer, gave voice to the forgotten logistics men. Ravelli's work in particular transformed public understanding of the campaign. He wrote not as a distant scholar, but as a witness, describing the mechanics of suffering that defined the Mule Corps' existence. Every movement was a struggle against silence, snow, and the limits of flesh. Yet they went on, step after step, because someone had to. By the dawn of the 21st century, the story had become part of Italy's cultural consciousness. School curricula included sections on the Eastern Front. Regional museums displayed artifacts recovered from Russian battlefields, rusted mule shoes, frozen diaries, brass harness fittings. Younger Italians, distanced from the war by generations, saw in the mule drivers not soldiers of a defeated cause, but symbols of human endurance. The German perspective, too, began to shift. Newly published Wehrmacht archives revealed the extent of reliance on Italian logistics. One document from Army Group South described the Alpini mule columns as the arteries through which the Southern Front breathes. Another report bluntly stated, "The Italian system of pack transport compensated for the mechanical paralysis of our divisions." These were not words of flattery. They were admissions of necessity. In Soviet archives, scattered reports confirm this dependence from the other side. Red Army intelligence noted with precision that enemy resupply on the Don is maintained chiefly by Italian pack columns. The Soviet High Command even issued orders to prioritize airstrikes against mule convoys, recognizing their strategic value. That the Italians endured despite this targeted destruction is nothing short of extraordinary. Today, the legacy of those men lives on in the regimental traditions of the modern Italian Army's Alpini Corps. Though mules have largely disappeared from military service, the symbolic connection remains. Every year, at the annual Adunata degli Alpini, a massive gathering of veterans and soldiers held in a different city, a small group marches with live mules, their harnesses adorned with the same brass bells once heard on the steppes. As the animals walk, a hush falls over the crowd. The sound of hooves striking pavement echoes like memory itself, distant, rhythmic, eternal. At those moments, the past feels close again. The faces of young recruits blur with those of the old men, watching from the sidelines. Somewhere in the rhythm of those steps lies the heartbeat of a forgotten army. Not the conquerors of cities, but the carriers of burdens. The story of the Italian Mule Corps reminds us that history's greatest acts of courage often occur far from the battlefield. These men did not seek heroism. They practiced it through endurance. In their quiet way, they revealed the hidden architecture of war, the vast, unseen network of human effort that sustains every victory and magnifies every defeat. When we speak of the Eastern Front, we speak of frozen rivers, of tanks locked in ice, of men lost in snow. But we should also speak of the mules, of the slow, patient rhythm of hooves that kept an empire moving for just a little longer. Their tracks have long since vanished from the Russian plains, but the echo remains, a faint reminder that strength is not always measured in firepower, but in persistence. And perhaps that is the truest lesson of all. For while generals planned campaigns and ideologues dreamed of conquest, it was the mule drivers, anonymous, uncelebrated, and endlessly enduring, who carried the real weight of war. They carried it through the mud of the Don, through the blizzards of the steppe, through the silence that follows defeat. They carried it back across Europe, in their memories, in their scars, in their quiet understanding of what it means to endure when everything else has failed. Their story ends not in triumph, but in survival. And in survival, perhaps, there lies a kind of victory, not for nations or empires, but for the stubborn resilience of the human spirit. The snow has melted, the mules are gone, and the men who led them have joined the silence they once walked through. But as long as their story is told, their footsteps and hoofbeats will never fade completely.